Okay, in this next sequence of videos, we're going to talk about numbers, and specifically how the distinction between System 1 and System 2 plays out when thinking about numbers, or even more specifically, how System 1 pushes you around when thinking about numbers. It's important to understand this because System 1 will push you around when you're thinking about numbers if you don't understand it. And if you understand it, there's at least hope that you can use System 2 to intervene when System 1 is likely to be leading you in the wrong direction when thinking about numbers and help you go in the right direction. So let's start with a simple example. On the sort of little mini exam thing you completed on the first day of class, there was a question where you had to answer how old is Gandhi when he died. Everybody had the question, how old is Gandhi when he died? But some of you had one question before that, and some of you had a different question. About half of you had the question, was Gandhi more than 114 when he died? Preceding, how old was he? And about half of you had the question, was Gandhi more than 46 when he died? Preceding, how old was he? Those who had the prompt of 114 picked a mean score of 89. That is, the average of all your scores for Gandhi's age at death was 89. Those who had a prompt of 46, the average for all your scores was 63. This is called the anchoring effect. The anchor that you're given pushes you around. Crucially, the anchor does not always push you around in this way. Here's one way it could work, but it doesn't always work this way. You just see the number 114, and you consciously, at the level of System 2, say, well, given that I've been given the number 114, the answer is probably close to that. Or you see the number 46, and you say, given that I've been given that number, the answer is probably close to that. But when you ask people, and if you're in class and you do the in-class exercise, you'll see in your discussion with people, lots of people who pick a high number don't give that kind of reason. They say, I picked 100 years old because he looked so old and frail, he must have been ancient. And lots of people who pick a low number don't give the prime as the reason that they picked the number they picked. They say things like, well, he was so frail, he must have been very young when he died. They often give the very same reason for him being super old when he died as the people who pick a low answer give for him being young when he died. But really, it's just the prime that's pushing you around. System 1 sees 114, wants to do something with that. System 1 sees 46, wants to do something with that. And then the story you tell yourself about why you picked what you picked often doesn't track that you're just being pushed around by the number. The same thing happens for the height of the redwoods. So everybody had the question, what is the height of the tallest redwood? For half of you, this was preceded by, is the tallest redwood more or less than 1,200 feet? For half of you, it was preceded by, is the tallest redwood more or less than 150 feet? Those who had the high prime of 1,200 feet picked an average height for the redwoods of 1,031. Those who had the low height picked an average height for the redwoods of 227. So you can see very profoundly here that the prime is pushing you around. And again, that can operate at the level of System 2 in principle. So in principle, you might have said, well, he gave me 1,200 feet, so I'm going to pick something near that. Or he gave me 150 feet, so I'm going to pick something near that. But often it's not operating that way. It's just, you consciously know, like, look, I'm going to ignore that 1,200, but System 1 does not ignore it, it uses it. And then the question is, how does it use it? And there's actually cool experiments that help us understand exactly how System 1 uses it. Here's what we do know. Prompts heavily influence the numbers people assign for Gandhi's age and redwood's height. It happened in your class, it happens in every class, it happens in every group of people. So I already had given you the results from the classes. There's a variety of ways in which this plays out in the real world, and I'll talk about this a little bit before explaining how exactly the effect works. There's a whole slew of experiments. You can read about them in the reading if you're interested. Again, the reading's not required, but if you're interested, they're there. When you give real estate agents house descriptions, so you'd give complete descriptions of the house, its history, its the square footage of the rooms, the number of bathrooms, the recency with which the roof was replaced, and so on and so forth, and ask them based on this kind of description to estimate the price of the house, they'll give you one number. If you then say, here's the number we think it's worth, and give them the same exact description, and have a high number, they'll pick a higher number than they otherwise would have picked. And if you pick a low number and say, here's how much we think it's worth, here's the low number, and here's the description, they'll pick a lower number than they would pick without a number being given to them. They'll simultaneously say, as all real estate agents do, that the list price does not affect my judgment at all. All that's affecting my judgment is the square footage, the neighborhood, the quality of the bathrooms, and so on and so forth. It's the descriptive stuff that affects my judgment. The price I'm given doesn't matter. But experiments show that exactly the opposite is true, that the price you're given does play a heavy role in driving your judgment of the assessment of the value of houses for people who are presumably experts in assigning house value, real estate agents. Another kind of example, when you give a suggested museum donation, say, this is the 125 stands for, this is on page 125 of the reading. Not that it's the 125th page you'll see, but if you look at the page numbers on the document, it'll be on page 125. When you give a suggested amount for museum donations, you might have wondered why they do that. If the actual amount is, if it's free, it's just a donation, so it's just suggested. You could choose 0 if you want. Why do they say suggested amount $5 or suggested amount $10? And the answer is very simple. If you suggest an amount, people are likely to pick a number close to that amount. Here's my favorite example of this, which is a clear case of System 1 pushing people around. This is an experiment that's on page 126 in the text, done on some judges in Germany. And what they had them do basically was this. They'd read a case file from an actual criminal proceeding, and they'd be asked to say what the appropriate sentence for the person was. So they know the person's guilty. What's the appropriate sentence? And they do this for a series of case files, each time being asked, what's the appropriate sentence? And before they assign the sentence, the judges are asked to roll dice. And the dice are loaded. So the dice will land, some judges are given dice loaded to land on relatively low numbers, like 3, say. Some judges are given dice loaded to land on relatively high numbers, maybe like a 5 and a 6, you get an 11. And what they found is that if you roll dice that are loaded to land low right before you give your sentence, but after you've read the case file, you'll give a lower number than you will if, for the very same case, if you roll dice that are loaded to land high. And of course, this isn't done to a single subject. It's not like the single judge does the same case twice and rolls high and low and gets different answers. It's done across judges. So some judges are given a series of cases and rolling low numbers. Some judges are given a series of cases and rolling high numbers, and the roll of the dice influences the length of the sentence they think is appropriate. That's clearly System 1 pushing them around because there's no way a judge would say, well, I rolled a 11, so 9 months is the right jail sentence. There's another example that's standard from grocery stores when they say limit of X number of objects per customer. So the famous Campbell's soup study, limit of 10 cans per customer. If you don't put a limit on the number of cans people buy, people tend to buy, in that study, like 4 cans or something. But when you do put a limit of, say, 10 cans, people will tend to buy like 8 or 9 cans. And why is that? It's because 10 is serving as a prime, making System 1 say pick something close to that, and you sort of move off of that prime in one direction or another, but it influences the judgment you make at the end of the day. So the limit per customer thing is not a way for the grocers to make sure everybody gets a chance to have the opportunity to buy the thing. I mean, that could play a role, but it's not the primary driver. The primary driver is they know if they put a limit per customer, people will buy more than they otherwise would if they put a high enough limit. Another example is caps on damages in court cases. So there's an interesting fact about what's called tort reform. Some people think that there should be what's called tort reform, which means when you sue, one kind of tort reform is that when you sue, there will be limits on the amount you can sue for. So if I get cancer because I swim in a local river and you've been polluting the local river, and then I sue you, I can't sue you for $10 trillion. I can't say the mental anguish and my life is worth $10 trillion. There's some objective limit to how much I can sue you for. That would be a cap on damages, a limit on how much I can sue you for. And people who want tort reform typically want to put caps on damages, and they say it's because they don't, it interferes with the marketplace. If a business can be sued for any amount of money. So typically what their aim is to lower the amount that gets paid out. Whereas people who are against caps on damages say, look, if you give me cancer and kill me and kill everybody in my neighborhood, we should be able to sue you for as much as we can get, a jury to say is appropriate. So they typically want the awards to be higher. Well, in fact, caps on damages do the exact opposite thing in experiments. When you put caps on damages, the amount that companies end up paying out goes up. Why is that? Because in a case where you would have thought the appropriate amount was $200,000, but you're told that the cap is $10 million, you'll be like, 10 million's the prime. It pushes System 1 to scream, say 10 million's appropriate. So it drives up the amount for most awards towards the cap. Nearly every award gets closer to the cap than it otherwise would be. Okay, so how does this effect work? Well, there's a couple of different ways it can work. One way is by having the anchor as a starting point. So you start with the anchor, that is, you start with the number you're given, and you then adjust in the direction of plausibility from that anchor. And you stop when you reach the edge of the plausible range. So this is the first way it can work. Let me give a little illustration. Suppose we have Gandhi here, okay? And we're thinking about Gandhi's age. So we come along and this person, or let's do the redwood height, sorry. This person says, you're asking me how tall a redwood is. 150 is the prime you've given me. Well, 150 is too low. I know they're taller than that. So system one sort of starts there and works its way up. The thing in the thought bubble here isn't the person sort of consciously doing it. It's system one sort of working, although it could be someone consciously doing it. Whereas the person who's given 1200 as the starting point will think that's too high, so they'll start there and move down. Well, if you start at 200 and move up until you start at 150 and move up until you get to the edge of the reasonable range, you might stop at around 200. If you start at 1200 and move down until you get to the edge of the reasonable range, you might stop at around like 800 or 1000 or something like that. So the average for the group given 150 will be close to the sort of lower edge of the reasonable range you would have picked if somebody hadn't given you a prime. And the average for people given the high prime will be towards the upper end of the range you would have picked if you hadn't been given a prime. So the idea is give me no prime and I'll say, well, it's somewhere between 200 and 800. But then you give me a prime of 1200, I start there, I go down until I get to the 800, say that's it. You give me the prime of 150, I start there and I go up until I get to the 200 and I say that's it. And of course, it's going to work the same way for Gandhi's age. So that's how it works if the anchor is a starting point and you adjust in the direction of plausibility. And sometimes anchoring effects do work that way. In both of the cases we looked at, they work exactly that way. To see that they work that way, notice that nearly everyone who chose a high number and was given the high prime chose a number that was lower than 1200. And nearly everyone who was given a low number, the 150, chose a number that was higher than 150, suggesting that the people given the low number are moving upward and the people who are given the high number are moving downward. The same thing for Gandhi's age. Nearly everyone given 46 went up a bit and nearly everyone given 114 went down a bit. Sometimes anchors work just as straight primes. So it just causes the number at issue to pop into your mind and you just pick something close to the number at issue. You may go up a little, you may go down a little, but you just are heavily influenced by the number you're given. So here, if you start with a high anchor, what happens is you think of whatever reasons could make that anchor plausible, and then you choose something near to it. If you start with a low anchor, it brings to mind whatever reasons you could think of that would make that answer plausible, and you pick the low number. Think of this in relation to Gandhi and his frailness. So if you're given a high number, you think like, okay, he was frail, he was bald. You think of all of the things that fit with a high number. You think of a low number, you might think, okay, he was sickly, he was assassinated. All of the facts that fit with a low number come to mind. Okay, so if the redwood effect worked as just a prime, it would go like this. Now, I said already it doesn't. It works with the anchor as a starting point and adjust in the direction of plausibility. But suppose it was just a prime, here's how it would work. This person would sort of automatically think, what would make 150 right, and invoke all the considerations that work with 150, fit with 150. And the person given 1200 would think, what makes that right, and invoke all the considerations that fit with 1200. And again, when I say they would think, it's like their automatic reasoning system is bringing those considerations to mind. Okay. How to protect yourself against being driven by system one when you're given anchors? Well, a couple of things you can do. Overcoming them requires engaging system two whenever you're given an anchor. So anytime someone throws a number at you before asking you about what number is appropriate or correct or whatever, always engage system two. Always think critically. Don't just spit out an answer. What do you do once you engage system two? There's a couple strategies you can use. First, if somebody gives you an anchor, like they give you the problem, was Gandhi more or less than 114 when he died? How old was he when he died? You can consider alternative anchors explicitly. So get your brain to think of another number. Think like, okay, I was given 114. What if the question were, was Gandhi more or less than 46? How would I reply? What if the question was Gandhi more or less than 75? How would I reply? So just think of other numbers that are competing anchoring points before you give an answer. Just bring them to mind. Another thing you can do is you can use the mean for the population as an anchor. Now, this is specific to the Gandhi case, but the general point holds, and I'll say what it is in a second. So in the Gandhi case, you'd say, well, look, I don't know much about Gandhi, but I know the average adult human lives to about 75, so I'm going to use 75 as my anchor. And then any facts that come to mind, like he was frail or he was assassinated, I will use to adjust a bit up or a bit down from 75, but I'm not going to let them push me too far off of that 75 as the anchor. You can also think of trees you've seen in your experience and say, I'm not going to allow myself to be pushed too far off that anchor. You can use your own sort of relevant background beliefs and knowledge as your anchor. Okay, and we'll stop this segment there and continue next time by talking a little bit more than we did last time about the conjunction fallacy, which is with Linda the bank teller.